Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. May have some more folks wander in, we'll see. And when we start here in just a second, we're going to be starting with Matthew chapter 8, verse 23. And just very briefly, my usual non-introduction is...
Did you have a Bible study last week?
Yeah. It's on the website. That's what I'm getting to. We started with Matthew 8, verse 23. And all of the Matthew Bible studies are up on the church website. So you can listen there to hear my various introductions and repeat introductions and references back to the introductions and all that kind of thing. To your heart's content there. So for today, just to get us sort of caught up to where we are in this Gospel of Matthew, and try to be a little quick about it. We talked about how this is the Gospel according to St. Matthew. That what that means is that this is a Gospel is an account of a victory. And so what St. Matthew is writing to us is an account of Christ's victory. And so we've seen so far that Matthew went out of his way, especially at the beginning of the book, to sort of set up these parallels for us between Jesus' ministry and the end of Moses' ministry and the beginning of Joshua's ministry in the Old Testament, when Moses led the people up to the sort of the gateway to the Promised Land, and then Joshua came and led them through the Jordan River into Canaan to conquer it. And we talked about how in chapters 5 through 7 we read the Sermon on the Mount, which Jesus gave from a mountain, and we talked about how that was sort of in parallel to the book of Deuteronomy that Moses gave to the people from the mountain before they entered into the land of Canaan to take possession of it. Telling them how they were to live and how they were to be the new people that they had been brought there to be, how they were to live once they got into the land. And so Christ was doing the same thing with this group of followers who he inherited from St. John the Forerunner, from St. John the Baptist, right, who after his baptism in the Jordan, he's now brought into the land. And starting in Galilee, we've already seen he started in Galilee, sort of has been working his way south, right, sort of very slowly. And we saw that rather than, again, after he leads them into the land, rather than what people might have expected, the last time in particular we saw this, in terms of the Messiah coming and winning these military victories, coming and attacking the Romans, or coming and driving out the unclean, out of the land. Jesus specifically, his first major actions were what? To heal a leper, to heal the slave of a Roman centurion, right? All the people who should be the enemies. He's, instead of treating them as enemies, he's purifying and justifying them and bringing them over to the right side, bringing them over to God's side, rather than judging them and cutting them off the way they might have expected. So he's going about reclaiming the land in a different way than they would have planned to see. And we also saw he healed St. Peter's mother-in-law, not necessary to lump in mother-in-laws with lepers and Roman slave owners, but it just so happened in sequence. And then we saw that those healings quickly became public, and so we went from Jesus having one type of follower, the people who he preached his Sermon on the Mount to all of a sudden getting a much bigger crowd, shall we say. As we saw at the end, sort of had some different interests and different motives for following him than purely believing he was the Messiah and wanting to be a part of the people he was leading. And so he issued a couple of, right where we left off last time, he issued a couple of warnings in terms of, before you decide you're going to come and follow me, you need to realize what this is going to entail. And maybe you won't be so enthusiastic. So now we'll go ahead and pick up here, chapter 8, verse 23. Now when he got into a boat, his disciples followed him. And suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves. But he was asleep. Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." So this sea that they were in was the Sea of Galilee. Should have left my map from last time up here. So remember, they've been up here, Capernaum's about there, right? They've been up here in Galilee, and now they get onto a boat, they go out onto the sea. We talked about how Peter and many of the other disciples were fishermen, essentially, on the Sea of Galilee. That's how they made their living, was by what they could catch. So they get out in the boat, they go out in the sea, a storm hits the sea, it's so bad that the waves are coming over the top of the boat, and Jesus is laying in the boat asleep. Unconscious. Right? Which, of course, causes some consternation among the disciples. You go and say, "Lord, save us, we're perishing." Right? The boat's about to sink, we're all going to die. Right? This is essentially what they're saying. We're all going to die. Now's not the time for a nap. Right? But he said to them, "Why are you fearful, O you of little faith?" Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. So the men marveled, saying, "Who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him?" So he wakes up, he says, "Why are you guys so worried?" Tells the weather right, to quiet down. Storm disappears, sea goes flat. It doesn't say so. I like to think he went back to sleep. And just left the disciples standing there like, what just happened? But right, and so they say, "Who can this be that even the winds and the sea obey him?" Well, why do they ask that? Who, they met him. Right? They've been hanging around with him. Right? They've seen him healing people. They've seen him casting out demons.
But at that time, they are still not sure.
Well, they've seen all this stuff happening.
Now it's the natural element. It's not just
Right.
people.
Right. So they had in their minds, as we've already seen, and some of the other people had in their minds that he's the Messiah, right? That he's this person who's going to come and set them free and rule over Israel, right? So they think he's the Messiah. That's one thing, okay? But there's another anything saying that in the Old Testament we saw prophecies about the Messiah opening the eyes of the blind, right, causing the lame to walk, and this is all stuff that Old Testament prophets did too, right? Remember Elijah and Elisha? Elijah even raised somebody from the dead, right? So I mean, this is kind of par for the course Messiah stuff, right? Messiah stuff, right? Now he's controlling thunderstorms and waves.
Controlling nature.
Okay, he's controlling nature. Now, just for reference, who is the king of the gods as far as the Romans are concerned? Jupiter or Jove or Zeus, depending on which. Yeah. Which name you want to use for him. But yeah, Jupiter or Jove or Zeus. Who's the god of what? Thunder and lightning. He's a storm god. And he's a storm god. In the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament, over and over again, who's the god who they kept going to worship instead of Yahweh, who they're supposed to worship? Baal. Baal was a storm god, and his big claim to fame, when you read the as we all have occasion to, when you read the epics of Baal in Ugaritic. Right? But in the ancient epics, the mythology about Baal, his big story was he won this great victory over this other god named Yam. Yam being the word for the sea. So he's a storm god, and his major exploit was defeating the sea. We talked before about how the sea was sort of an image of chaos and that kind of thing in ancient Near Eastern mythology. So this isn't just God stuff. This is King of the Gods stuff, right? This is the most powerful God stuff, right? Because if Jesus can just stand up in a boat and say, "Be quiet," and make a thunderstorm disappear, right? That means he's more powerful than both these guys, right? And any other storm gods from anywhere else we want to line up, right? But he's a human being. That's why the disciples are kind of like, right? Who is this, right? We've gotten this far, right? We've gotten this far, but this is a whole lot farther. This is a whole lot farther.
That would be a whole new step for them in a way.
A big giant step.
Because he just swapped them all.
Yeah.
They just get up and say, "Be quiet."
This wasn't, and this isn't something that they had in Roman mythology, right? There were heroes, right? You had gods and then you had heroes, right? Perseus, Hercules, all this, right? So they had this idea that they were sort of demigods, right? There were people who, one parent was a human and one parent was a god, and so they do stuff like Hercules would kill the Nemean lion with his bare hands. Cool stuff like that, right? None of them did stuff like this, right? So this isn't even in mythological view, right? This isn't even. Okay. There isn't a category for this other than, as far as the Jewish mind was concerned, right? Because they don't worship these gods. They don't worship these gods. So as far as the Jewish mind is concerned, right? There's Yahweh, who's in control of this kind of stuff. Now, there's people who are not in control of that kind of stuff. Okay. So this is really honestly the first revelation to the disciples, at least, and to us as we're reading through Matthew. We've gotten hints, like the fact that he didn't have a father. He didn't have a human father. But this is our first indicator here that, frankly, Jesus is God. Right? That this person isn't just another representative like the prophets of the Old Testament, or even the greatest one of the prophet representatives. That this is God himself. Right? This is God himself coming to his creation. And now this next story is going to pick up on this idea and develop it. Verse 28, when he had come to the other side, to the country of the Gergesenes, there met him 2 demon-possessed men, coming out of the tombs, exceedingly fierce, so that no one could pass that way. And suddenly they cried out, saying, "What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" Now a good way off from them there was a herd of many swine feeding. So the demons begged him, saying, "If you cast us out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine." And he said to them, "Go." So when they had come out, they went into the herd of swine, and suddenly the whole herd of swine ran violently down the steep place into the sea, and perished in the water. Then those who kept them fled, and they went away into the city and told everything, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. And behold, the whole city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to depart from their region. So you may have noticed a couple odd things in this story. Right? So they come to the other side of the sea. They're somewhere over here, on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which means they're now in Gentile territory. Right? Which you can, of course, tell because they got a herd of pigs. Not a lot of pig herding going on in Judea.
Isn't that one of the areas where one of the tribes of Jacob's supposed to be?
Supposed to be, but they were long gone. Yeah, this is the best you're going to do over here is Samaritans. But over here we're dealing with Gentiles, right? And he comes and they run into these two demon-possessed men on the road who won't let anyone pass. Now this may provoke the question. There's these two demon-possessed guys running around, right? Blocking this road and not letting anyone pass. Why is everyone just sort of letting this happen? Right? Why don't the Romans go kill them? Right? They clear the road, right? Why don't they do something about it? Well, we have to go back a little bit to how they viewed demon possession at this time in history. Okay, first the word from which we get demon is the Greek word daimon. And in Greek, this word did not have sort of the connotation it has in English. When we think of a demon, we think of like an evil spirit. Right? The evil part was not necessarily the case originally in Greek. In Greek, this word originally meant an ancestral spirit, but came to mean just sort of any lower tier spirit. They had a pretty complex ranking system. They had gods, right? Plural for them, right? And so there were the gods, and then underneath them were the daimon. Right? These spirits are sort of one step down. And then even one step down from them, they had Thea, which is usually translated as like divinities or something like that, which were like spirits that lived in the woods, that kind of thing. Spirits that made you fall in love. Cupids and stuff. Right? That kind of thing. Sort of the really low level folks. So these two top categories, the gods and the daimon, were worshipped as gods. You would find temples to these. Okay. And even some of the call them the spirits who we would typically think of as Greek gods, right, were actually classified as daimon. For example, Apollo, right, the sun god Apollo, was a daimon. So this word means just a wide variety of spirits. And we've talked before about how in both Greek and Roman religion they believed that in order to interact with one of these spirits, if you wanted to. Why would you want to? Well, usually because you want something from them. Right? You're trying to get someone to fall in love with you. You're hoping a business deal will work out. You're going into battle and you want to win. Right? You know, these kind of things. Right? You need to contact this spirit who's in charge of such things. Right? You have to get in contact with them and then ask them for this favor. And so you generally do that by ingratiating yourself somehow to this god, usually by offering them a sacrifice, by offering them food, right? And then you hope that whatever you offer them is enough to get them to grant your favor, and that they're in a good mood that day, because if they're not, you could end up in big trouble. So, in order to make this two-way contact, though, these spirits, since they didn't have bodies, needed to have one. Right? Since they don't have a body, they can't talk to you, they can't communicate with you. So there were two ways you did that. The first one was through an eidolon, which is where we get the word idol in English, through an image, right? Through a statue. And this is why in most of the temples, pretty much all of the Greek and Roman temples, you find a statue of the god at the center. Right? Two of the wonders of the ancient world were statues of goddesses in their temples, gigantic statues. The idea being you come there, you offer your sacrifices, you offer your stuff, God shows up and possesses the statue, right? You talk to the statue, say, here's what I want, you cross your fingers. Right? The other way was through demon possession. And so there were people called oracles. Probably the most famous one being the oracle at Delphi, who were possessed by these spirits. Sometimes permanently, sometimes it would be periodically. And periodically, I mean, they would, at particular times or seasons or whatever, or they'd do a ritual, and then at the end of the ritual, they'd be possessed, and then the spirit would speak through them. The oracle at Delphi was possessed by Apollo. The ancient world. And people traveled all over the ancient world to get to Delphi to ask the oracle at Delphi what was going to happen in the future and for advice and all these kinds of things. So, a person being possessed by one of these spirits is not seen as a bad thing. Right? A lot of times people look at the New Testament, see these demon possessions, and say, oh, well, they were just a bunch of primitives and they didn't understand mental illness. Right? So somebody was mentally ill and they said, oh, he's demon possessed. That's not what it is at all. It's a completely different idea. As I said, the Romans thought it was a good thing. And the Romans were not idiots. They didn't think that someone who was schizophrenic, that was a good thing. Right? They understood madness. They had that category. They understood this person is not in their right mind. They are sick mentally. They had an idea of mental illness. But this was a state that certain people had where they would be possessed. And sometimes we also talked about during festivals, like the Bacchanalia, there were these lesser spirits, the Bacchae, who worked for Bacchus, who was the god of wine, that would come and possess people. They would deliberately go out in the streets and drink and dance and party until they were possessed by these spirits, and then they'd go crazy in the street and burn things down and commit rapes. And this was a big annual feast. Clean up afterwards. So demonic possession was seen as maybe a neutral thing, in a lot of cases a positive thing. Right? This is a positive thing. We're going to see in the book of Acts, when St. Paul cast a demon out of the slave girl, and it said her owners get mad, because that's how they made money, was her fortune telling, right? So they considered that a good thing. But also, this demonic possession happened in sort of I don't know, I guess I'd say a gross way, like in the Oracle of Delphi, where Apollo would just speak through the oracle. It also happened, at least supposedly, in a more subtle way. So, for example, in Plato's Theaetetus, Socrates, the philosopher, says that he has a daimon living inside him that whispers wisdom to his soul. Now, if someone said that to me now, I'd be pretty creeped out, right? I have a demon that lives in me who whispers things to my soul. Let's get away from me, right? But that was the fact that Socrates was so wise, right? They understood that, well, of course, right? He has beyond human wisdom, right? And as we know with the early Christian martyrs, in the Roman world, they offered sacrifices to the emperor. Technically speaking, they did not sacrifice to the emperor because the emperor was a human being. They sacrificed to the genius of the emperor. The genius of the emperor, which was the spirit, the divine spirit of the emperor. That's what you were offering the sacrifice to. Not the human being, the emperor, but the emperor's divine spirit. Right? Even more reason why the Christians wouldn't do it, right? That's the spirit possessing the emperor? No, right? It's not. So, why did nobody do anything about these two men on the roads? Well, these two men on the roads had been touched by the gods. These two men on the road weren't two people suffering from some kind of mental illness. These were two people on the roads who had been given these gifts by the gods. Right? So if they wanted to no one to pass down that road, there was probably a reason. Right? And anything those two men said to anyone, they would have taken back and tried to interpret, right, as being some kind of wisdom. Right? So, these two would have been seen less as, two mentally ill homeless people, right? Like we might think of. There's two mentally ill homeless people over at the mall, and they're not letting anyone go to the mall, right? That's not how they saw them. Right? They saw this as more like, these are the two gurus who live up in the mountain, right? They don't wear any clothes, and they don't eat anything. They have some kind of spiritual wisdom. Right? It's more like that. More that kind of idea. Okay? But notice what they say to Jesus when they run into Jesus. Right? They say, "What have we to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" So there's two pieces there. Number one, they recognize him. Right? They call him what? The Son of God. That's the first time we've seen that in the Gospel of Matthew. Remember last time he referred to himself as the Son of Man. And we talked about how that sort of literally means son of Adam. Referring to himself as a human being, but also connecting himself to the Son of Man in Daniel. Remember he came up before the Ancient of Days. So he connected himself to that figure. But now this is Son of God. Son of God. Well, we got a clue here from the storm being calmed. Right? What Matthew was implying. Right? And as I said back, remember, didn't have a human father. Right? So let's piece this together. No human father can control storms. Right? Who is his father? His father is God. Right? His father is God. Like the actual God. Right? In Greek, the Greek of the New Testament, they wanted to be so clear that they weren't talking about gods, because they have to use the same words. Right? They wanted to make it so clear they weren't talking about the Greek gods, that whenever they talk about God in the New Testament in Greek, they always put a definite article in front of it. So literally it's the God. Right? The God. Just to distinguish. We're not talking about one of those. Right? We're talking about the God. So literally they say to him, call him son of the God. Here. Just make it clear. Not son of a god, not son of Zeus like Hercules. Right? Not son of but son of the God. Another thing to note is that this was actually one of Caesar's titles. Starting with Augustus, all of the Roman emperors had the title I know there's way too many I's in that. Divi Filii, which means Son of God.
Pronounce that again.
Divi Filii. The Filii is the son part. Son of God. And Augustus first took that because, of course, he had declared himself Caesar's son, which he wasn't. But he declared himself Caesar's son. And since Julius Caesar, after his assassination, had become a god, ergo that makes him the son of a god. But here, it's son of the God. Son of the God. And the second part is, have you come here to torment us before the time? Well, this tells us a couple of things. It tells us, if he's son of the God, well, the God, right, if there's a the God, has to be up here, right? right? And that the judgment, right? Because we've read a lot of the Old Testament about judgment, right? And everybody we read about it, it's been about what? It's been about human beings. Right? Even in the Creed, he's going to judge the living and the dead. Right? Well, that's human beings. Living human beings, dead human beings. Right? And separate out two peoples. Well, this seems to tell us that when that time comes, right, before the time, right, we've heard about the day, the time, in the Old Testament, the prophets always refer to this day of judgment, that apparently these spirits are going to be judged too. Or at least they're expecting to be. Right? These spirits are going to be judged too. Okay? Which tells us again a few things. It tells us that the God who Jesus is the son of, right, is more powerful than all these spirits. That all these spirits are daimon, they're these lesser spirits. This is why, we'll get to this in a couple of years here. Maybe 3 at the rate we're going. But where St. Paul says all the gods of the nations are demons, right? He's not saying they're all evil per se. He's saying all those things that they worship, everything else that people worship other than the God, are just these lesser things. These lesser things. If God's going to judge them, what else does that mean? It means He created them. Right? Because He's coming to judge His creation. Right? So, St. Paul is saying that all the nations are worshiping these things, these created things, rather than the Creator who created them. So these you get it sort of straight from the demon's mouth here. Right? You get it straight from them. Right? Who Jesus is, now pieced together, and the fact that they and all of their kindred are just these lesser created spirits who are preparing to be judged. Preparing to be judged. And now they're worried that now that Jesus has shown up, they're going, wait a minute, it's not the day of judgment yet, according to our calendars. You know? Right? Why are you here? Why are you here already? Right? Because when He shows up, that means it's time for judgment. Right? It's time for judgment. It's the Messiah. Right? It's time for judgment. And remember what we were saying last time. Gospel is an account of a victory. And we talked last time, all the people at the time thought were the villains, thought were the enemies, right? The unclean, like the lepers, right? The sinners, right? The Romans, big A number 1, right? The Gentiles. All the people who they thought were the enemies, Jesus has been coming and not treating them as the enemy, right, but bringing them over into the camp. Now we're seeing, right afterwards, second half of this chapter, who is the enemy? Who is the enemy that Jesus is here fighting? Who's He trying to be victorious over?
The lesser God.
These demons. Yeah. These evil spirits who have taken captive not just these two guys, right, but have taken captive God's people, right, and all of humanity, in the land, outside the land, right? That's who Jesus is here to defeat. Right? That's who He's here to make war against. He's here to make war against, as St. Paul is going to say again, we'll get there in a couple. That our war is not against flesh and blood, right, but against powers and principalities, right? He's just reiterating again here what we're already seeing in Matthew, right? That's who Jesus came to defeat. Right? The people who've led humanity astray, who are leading us to our destruction. Right? The beings that are leading us to our destruction. Through sin, right? Through death. That's who He's going to defeat. Okay? That's who He's making war against. And notice before he can even say anything in response, after they say, "Are you here to torment us before the time?" Right? Notice he doesn't say, "No, I'm not here to judge you now." Right? They notice they're a swine, and they beg for mercy. Essentially, right? They say, "Don't cast us out." Why would they want to go into pigs instead of just being cast out?
And still be occupied.
This is going to get a little. Yeah.
They want to habitat a living creature. That is what they do. Their dominion in this particular, as I understand it, their dominion has to be with something that is alive. In other words, they are not spirits that just wander the road, or those types of spirits that live in the forest. But the idea of going into the swine means I'm going to live one more day, and when you execute that swine, I can go back into the human body.
Well, possibly.
Not execute,
Possibly.
but to-
You're on the right trail there at the beginning. Right? Because the Greeks and the Romans weren't entirely wrong. Right? Remember how we said idolatry worked. Right? These spirits, they don't have body. They couldn't do anything by themselves. Right? They couldn't do anything by themselves. They have no power of their own. Right? Unless they can convince a human being to do something. Right? Unless they can convince this is true of all idolatry. Right? $1 bill, $100 bill, $1,000 bill. Did they print a $10,000 bill? I don't know. Just a piece of paper lying on a table. Can't do a darn thing by itself. Okay? But you could find two human beings who are willing to kill each other for it. For a piece of paper. Right? Piece of paper doesn't have any power. Unless the people are willing to give in to greed and anger. Same thing. Right? The only power they have is to destroy humanity. Right? They can't create anything. Only God can create. Can't make anything. All they can do is try to influence us to destroy ourselves and destroy the rest of God's creation. That's what they've got going. So if Jesus casts them out and sends them to hell, right, sends them to Gehenna, right, they're done. They're done. Party's over. Right? They've just gotten judged early. Right? They get to go to their permanent abode a couple thousand years earlier than the rest of their kind. Okay? So that's why they're begging. Citizens of the pigs. Right, citizens of the pigs. At least, if we're at the pigs, we're out here in the world. We could try and do something. But you notice when he sends them into the pigs, what happens to the pigs?
They drown.
They all run off the cliff and they drown. Because, again, that's all these spirits can do is destroy.
So are they destroyed when they drown?
Well, they then go to
Well, that's what I'm
Gehenna.
saying.
Yeah.
When they went and drowned, that ended their stay here.
They then go to Gehenna. They can't do anything constructive. They can't do anything. Right? And this is something important about the nature of evil. The Father's talking about this a lot. Right? Everything that God has created is good. Remember in creation, the story of creation, at the end of each day, he looks at it and he says it's good. Right? He says it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. Okay? Evil is not something else that came into existence from somewhere else. There's not two gods, right? We don't have a good God and an evil God. We talk about God and Satan, but it's not like a matchup, right? That's like lion and mouse, right? If the lion made the mouse, right? So that's not even a good analogy, right? Okay, there's not a dualism there. There's not a parallel there, right? Evil, according to the Father, is just parasitic, right? It's like a parasite. Has no life or existence of its own. It just latches onto God's creation and corrupts it and destroys it. And that's what it does to us. right? We tend to think, when we think about, for example, free will, all right? We tend to look at free will the same way Adam and Eve did, which is the wrong way, right? Now I'm free to do good or to do evil, right? Like we have to have evil there in order to be free, right? Evil is my option, right? It's my option. That's my freedom. That's why, when we're teenagers, we rebel against our parents, right? Because I have to prove I'm my own person. I'm not just part of my parents, right? So whatever they're about, I'm going to be about the opposite. Right? I'm going to be about the opposite. And the more I'm different from them, and the more I go down a different road, the more free I am, and the more of an individual I am. Right? Spiritually, we tend to think that same way about God. Right? Try to think that way about God. If God gives me rules, right? God gives me rules, then, He's trying to turn me into a person I'm not, right? That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. I have this idea all the saints just stand around like this, right? I don't want to be that type of person, right? So I need to go the other direction as far as I want, as far as I can possibly go, right? So I go and I join a Norwegian death metal band, right? Run around wearing all black and crazy makeup, and then I think, wow, I'm really an individual. I'm really free from society's constraints, right? And just like when we were teenagers and we don't realize that the rules our parents made for us were for our own good and our own safety, right, and our own protection. We don't realize that the reason God has given us rules is there's a way that leads to life and there's a way that leads to destruction, and He wants us to go down the way that leads to life. And that we're really free when we're going down that road that leads to life. That trying to get away from God and what He wants for us doesn't end up making us free. It ends up making us a slave to all kinds of things. Slave to all kinds of things. Why? Because all those sins, again, don't have any life of their own. They're like leeches. Right? They're like leeches, sucking the life out of us. Sucking the light, the happiness, and the goodness, and everything that God has given to us, sucking it out of us. And so it's getting free of that makes us free. So we see this exhibited here, not only who Jesus is, but that these spirits, these things that we want to chase after, these things that look good to us, these things that we maybe not as the same way they did, maybe not quite so crassly. We don't go and offer goats to the god Pluto, but we sure do cross our fingers and hope we get some money, in the lottery or whatever, right? These things we might even worship aren't anything, right? Aren't anything, and chasing after them just leads to destruction, right? But notice when everybody hears about what Jesus did, when they hear about, he cast the demons out of those two men out there, and then they went to the pigs, and pork prices are going to go up because of a shortage in the local area, right? When they hear about this, their response, remember we saw the response before earlier in the chapter. In Judea and Capernaum, they saw him casting out demons and healing people, and all these people showed up out of the woodwork now all of a sudden wanting to be his friend and wanting to be his followers. Right? Notice theirs is the exact opposite. Theirs is please leave. Please leave now. Right? Why? Because they're scared to death. Right? They're scared to death.
Is it because they know who He is?
Well, this is my question. My question is, which one of those groups really understood who Jesus was? The ones like the scribe who came up, Jesus, I'll follow you anywhere, after they did the healings? Or the ones who were terrified and told him, please leave? They're the ones who actually got who he was. Right? They're the ones who understood who who Jesus was. Right? And if the scribe had really understood, right, he would have had a very different response. Because remember, what happens? Remember what happened with Isaiah, when Isaiah all of a sudden found himself standing in the presence of God. We talked about there's not a really good way to translate it into English without using curse words. Right? He sort of yells something on the order of, "I'm blanked." Right? You can fill in the blank with whatever you want. Right? It fell on his face. Right? He didn't say, "Oh, it's you, God!" Ran up and gave him a hug. Right? That's not what happened. Right? Suddenly it was very clear to him who God was and who he was, and that he was in deep, deep trouble. Right? That's what these people realized. They realized who Jesus was and who they were, and they realized they were in deep, deep trouble. And they said, "Please leave. We're not ready. We're not ready for this. We can't handle this." Also remember, though he does leave now, he doesn't just abandon these people. Because remember, when he sends out his, as we'll see at the end of Matthew, right, in Matthew 28, the last chapter, when he sends out his disciples, he tells them to go to Judea, Samaria, over here, and then to the ends of the earth. So he sends his disciples back to them. He's just like the Roman centurion, just like the leper. He cares about these people too. And they convert and live. So chapter 9, verse 1. So he got into a boat, crossed over, and came to his own city. Right? They beg him to leave, so he says, "Okay, I'll leave." Gets in the boat, they sail back over. What's his own city? It's Capernaum again. Okay. Then behold, they brought to him a paralytic lying on a bed. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven you." So notice what it says when he saw their faith. Who? The faith of the people who brought him the paralytic. Why? Well, because by doing this, they're saying what? We believe that you, Jesus, can heal this paralyzed person. Right? So he says, "Be of good cheer, your sins are forgiven you." And at once, some of the scribes said within themselves, "This man blasphemes." Now notice it's not out loud. They just thought, that's blasphemy. But Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, "Why do you think evil in your hearts? For which is easier, to say, 'Your sins are forgiven you,' or to say, 'Rise and walk'?" Well, right? I guess it's easier to say your sins are forgiven you, right? Because there's no way to check, right? It's one of those things. It's like you go to these faith healers, right? You never see them regrowing an amputated limb or anything, right? They heal a lot of stuff that you can't really. I've got some nerve pain. Oh, it's gone. Well, it's harder to check, right? Well, if you've got somebody who's paralyzed and can't walk, right, and you're going to say to him, "Get up and walk," you're going to have pretty immediate verification as to whether you're able to do that. Whether you're able to do that. I'm not saying your sins are forgiven. Relatively easy. Verse 6, "But that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins." And then he said to the paralytic, "Arise, take up your bed and go to your house." And he arose and departed to his house. And when the multitude saw it, they marveled and glorified God, who had given such power to men. There's a couple things going on here. Now notice, first of all, they bring him this paralytic. They probably did not bring him the paralytic to have his sins forgiven. Right? That wasn't what they were aiming at. Right? So remember, when he was in Capernaum before, he was healing people. Right? So the problem, as far as they were concerned, right, as far as his friends were concerned, was our friend can't walk. Right? That's the problem. So when Jesus sees their faith and says to him, "Your sins are forgiven," what's he really saying? Right? right? Sort of subtly, but he's saying that's not actually your real problem, the fact that you can't walk. Right? Where have we just come from? Right? Remember, the last chapter, who's the real enemy? Right? Who's the real enemy? The unclean, the Gentiles, or evil spirits that lead us into sin and wickedness, right? So if the real enemy are these daimon, then the real problem is not physical sickness or physical ailments. The real problem is sin. The real problem is sin. Because there are going to be plenty of people in wheelchairs, right, in the kingdom of heaven. Right? Plenty of people in wheelchairs are going to make it to the kingdom of heaven. Plenty of people missing arms or legs are going to make it to the kingdom of heaven. Right? People with all kinds of sicknesses and disabilities. And in fact, sicknesses and disabilities for certain people might actually help them. Right? Might actually help them going through the struggles that can get into the kingdom of heaven. Okay? But there's no one who's immersed in sin who's going to make it into the kingdom of heaven. So in real terms, the problem that this man had, again, he could go through the rest of his life not walking, right, and still enter the kingdom of heaven. So his problem is he needs his sins forgiven, right? He needs, as we were talking about before, we were talking about justification last time, right? It means he wants to be found innocent, right, on the day of judgment. So he needs to be cleansed. He needs to be purified. He needs to be restored. That's what he needs. And so that's what Jesus gives him. Right? That's what Jesus gives him. Well, then the people, of course, say, right? They all start muttering because they say, hey, I don't know who you think you are. Maybe you're a prophet or something. Right? But even the prophets didn't go around forgiving people's sins. Once again, right? They did healings, they did miracles. They didn't forgive people's sins, right? Because God is the one who's going to judge on the last day. He's the one who's going to decide what mercy He's going to show and not going to show, right? He's the one who, when we go and make our sin offerings, decides whether He's going to accept them and forgive us, or whether He's going to, or not, right? That's God. You can't. You can't do that, Jesus. Right? This is the Messiah versus the person who can command the waves. And so he gives them an object lesson. Right? He says, okay, well, watch this. And I'm going to pick it up and walk. Right? And so he's healed of his paralysis and he can walk. But this is something more than just this one story. Right? This is here, St. Matthew puts this here in his gospel after a bunch of healings, and then we're going to have some more healings later on. He puts it sort of smack in the middle. Right? Because he's not just speaking about this healing. Right? He's talking about the purpose of all the healings. Right? The purpose of all the healings. All of the physical healings. Right? All the physical healings are not here as sort of magic tricks. Right? Oh, isn't this neat? Right? Isn't Jesus powerful? Right? Or isn't this nice? Right? Because it doesn't matter how great the miracle is, as has been pointed out, Lazarus, who He raised from the dead, eventually died again. Right? So none of this is permanent. Right? None of this is permanent. Saved Peter's mother-in-law from dying of a fever, but she did die eventually of something else. Right? The point of these healings is that they're a sign. They're a sign of what God is doing through Jesus in the whole land, ultimately the whole world. Right? i.e., what they've been expecting God to do is to come into His creation and judge it. Right? Separate out, here's the good people who they think they are, right, of course. And then you're the bad people. He's going to reward the good people. He's going to punish the bad people. Right? But what Jesus is doing is, He's coming and He's healing bad people and making them good. Right? Because what they don't understand is, what hasn't sunk into them, is that if they had really read their Old Testament, if they'd really read their scriptures carefully, again and again and again, what did we see in the prophets? God trying to get it through their heads of his own people Israel, that they were not righteous. Right? They were the ones who were sinning against him. And they were sinning worse than a lot of the people who weren't his people. Right? And how they were even more accountable because he gave them the law so they should know better. Right? I didn't give the 10 Commandments to the Assyrians. I gave it to you. Why are you behaving worse than them? We're just trying to get through them over and over again. And so what they don't realize is that God has come into his world in the person of Jesus, and all he's found are evil people. All he's found are people who have been corrupted by sin, to one degree or another. All he's found are people who are on the wrong track, leading towards death and destruction. And rather than condemning them all, rather than condemning his whole creation, right, he's here to heal and restore it. And so one becomes one of the good people, one of the righteous, right, at the judgment, by being one of the bad people who acknowledges it and repents and is cleansed and is purified and is healed. The literal wording of the Nicene Creed. More modern translations say that he's coming to judge the living and the dead. Okay? There's a reason why in King James English they had the quick and the dead. Because they had the word living in King James English. The word in Greek that's translated there as the quick, right, is, and this is a word that again we'll see in St. Paul, it becomes important in Corinthians. Zoopoies, it's those who have been made alive. It's not the living, it's those who have been made alive, who have been quickened in King James English. So, the two people who Christ is judging between, according to the Nicene Creed, are those who have been made alive and those who are dead. Right? Those who are dead in their sins and those who are used to be dead in their sins, but have been made alive in Christ. And so that's an important distinction. And it's tearing away at what the Pharisees, where we've talked a lot already about the Pharisees, and they're going to keep showing up. Right? The Pharisees who have the righteous and the clean, the unrighteous, the sinners, the unclean, over here in these two categories, the good and the bad. Right? Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, you're really over here too. But I'm inviting you all to come over here. But in order to come over here, you have to first admit that you're over here. That you're over here. And they can't get past that part. So that's an important, yeah.
Okay, Mike, two questions. One is that those that Jesus healed, that means he also, are you saying that he also healed them, forgave them of their sins, they became a new creature?
I'm saying those two ideas go together, yes.
Okay. Now, then Jesus, this is what he is saying when he is at the temple and he reads Isaiah.
Right.
That day has arrived and he sits down and says, yes, I am.
Yeah. Yep.
I shall open the... Now, when we talk about the blind,
yeah,
that's what I wanted to get to. Is he talking about the spiritual blindness of not recognizing who he is? Or what are we, the physical or both?
Both. Now we get to the Gospel of John, probably about a year or so. We get to the Gospel of John, there's that important passage with the blind man who he heals that deals with that.
Yes.
Where he heals the blind man, and then he and his family, his parents get interrogated by the Pharisees. you know.
He was born blind. Was he sinned? And that's
Yeah.
what they asked.
Right.
Did sin break the stop?
That whole story is St. John playing with that idea, right? The idea of who's really blind,
Yeah.
right? That it's the Pharisees who are actually blind because they can't see what's going on right in front of their faces. Right? But yeah, so those two ideas are together, right? Just like they're together in our services, right? When we do the Sacrament of Unction,
Yes.
it's for the healing of soul and body. Healing of soul and body, right? It's for the healing, physical healing, and the forgiveness of sins.
I understand that.
Yeah, because we're restoring, we're fighting against physical and spiritual corruption.
Yeah,
which
well,
go
what
together.
I'm thinking about is a church service that a lot of people went to, and they thought maybe they would be healed of their physical infirmities, but yet there was a tremendous amount of peace at that service, not necessarily that one was healed physically, but in the spiritual sense of peace, which you can overcome your infirmities. So, I guess I'm
Right.
not really sure because that's uncharted theology.
Well, if Jesus had left it at forgiving the paralytic's sins and not letting him walk, the paralytic would not have had a valid complaint. Right? Hey, I wanted to walk. All I got was my sins forgiven. That would not have been a valid complaint.
So he's saying there's a relationship between your infirmities and your sins. You say?
There's a relationship on the grand scale, yeah. I mean, the reason there's sickness and illness and death in the world is because of sin. Now, there's not a direct, as we saw in the book of Job, there's not a direct correspondence. Now, a lot of my superstitious Dutch relatives think there's a correspondence, right? Meaning, you get a really bad flu, it's because you did something, right? It's like, what were you doing when you first started feeling sick? See? See? You were down at the bar. Yeah, see? Right? That kind of thinking, right? There's not a correspondence, right? But there's a relationship. Right? There's a relationship. Okay. So now following from this, verse 9, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax office. He said to him, "Follow me," so he arose and followed him. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house that, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" When Jesus heard that, he said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So see, coming right out of this healing, this idea of his sins being forgiven, is the idea that Jesus is now going to sinners. We've talked a little bit about tax collectors before, but tax collectors, including St. Matthew, right, that's what he was, before Jesus calls him here. Tax collectors were pretty much the lowest form of life in Judea in the first century. And not just in the way that people hate the IRS today. Yes, I know people don't like the, I forget what game, I was watching a game show, and there was somebody on there, they asked him where he worked, this contestant. And he said the IRS, and he was in collections, and the audience literally booed him. Boo! Right? So yeah, we don't like tax collectors much either. Okay, but this went a lot further. This went a lot further in taxes then, because we've talked already about, obviously, Caesar, Roman Empire, is brutally dominating the people of Judea, considers them non-humans, right? Okay. Well, tax collectors are Jewish people who have decided they're going to work for the Romans. That right off the bat. Right? Right off the bat, they're a traitor to their whole race. Right? That alone would be enough for most of them to want to kill them. Right? But on top of that, the way they work for the Romans is they didn't have a tax code like we have. Right? Where they pass laws and you get deductions for this and that, people pay percentages of this and that income and all that. The way taxes worked then was the local governor decided, I want to repair this aqueduct. Right? I need X amount of money to repair this aqueduct. So he would gather up his tax collectors and say, go and get me this amount of money from the people. Right? He didn't care who they got it from. He didn't care, right, how they got it. He wanted the money and he wanted it on time. If he didn't get his money and didn't get it on time, then he'd probably execute the tax collector and go find money. Right? Because even though they were working with him, they still didn't really consider them human beings. So they'd say to their tax collector, one day go get me this amount. Next week, if they had another building project, go get me another couple of thousand. Right? Go knock on doors, get me the money. Here's the other thing. The tax collector happened to get more money than what the governor wanted. He got to pocket the rest. That's how he got paid. Okay. Now you may say,
License to steal.
yeah, he's literally licensed to steal. And you may say, well, why would they give the tax collector money? Well, because the tax collector was operating under Roman authority. So if he came and knocked on your door and said, I want 50 days' wages from you right now, and you said no, or you said I don't have it, he could call in the Roman soldiers and they would execute you for treason for not paying your taxes.
We think it's rough.
So it was extortion, right? I mean, beyond just theft, it was extortion, right? He's coming threatening you with death to deprive you of your money. And you never knew when he was going to be. He could be back the next day, looking for more. So, as you can imagine, these were about the most hated people there were. Right? You had nothing to do with these people. Okay? They were unclean because of doing business with the Romans. They were traitors. Right? They were thieves and criminals. Okay? And now Jesus walks into the tax office. Okay? There's a great, I don't know if you're familiar with the Renaissance artist Caravaggio, but he did the famous painting of St. Thomas putting his finger into the wound in Christ. A lot of people have seen that. He did this whole series of paintings for St. Matthew's Cathedral in Rome. And one of them is of the calling of St. Matthew. It's this great picture because there's this little dark room. Right? And you see Matthew, he's got this big beard. He's sort of hunched over this little table with all this money. He's in there counting. You know? And the door is cracked open, and there's sort of this shaft of light coming in and falling on him from the door. And you just see Jesus' finger like pointing at him across the room. Like, you. So Jesus walks into his tax office and says, you come follow me. Or this word follow me doesn't just mean, hey, come on, we're going down to get something to eat. Right? This word follow means he's called become his disciple. Become one of my followers. Become one of my inner circle of followers. Right? And of course the Pharisees, what? Right? Called who? Right? This is the last person you'd want. Right? They have anything to do with it. And not only that, but after he calls him, right? As Jesus sat at table in the house. What house? The tax office. Jesus goes in there and eats with him. And while he's in there breaking bread with them, the other tax collectors hear about it. And are, wait, who's doing what? Right? So they all start showing up. Right? And talking to Jesus. Right? He's hanging around with a whole bunch of tax collectors. A whole bunch of them now. Right? So the Pharisees go up to his other side, like, what? Right? What's this? You call this a rabbi? You're going around selling this as the Messiah? And, a bunch of tax collectors. Right? Clearly he's part of the problem, not the solution. Right? Because remember the way the Pharisees look at it. Right? We got to get rid of all these sinners like the tax collectors. And then God will deliver us from the Romans. He's punishing us for having them here. Right? He's punishing us for having them here. Now Jesus is eating with them. Right? And you notice it's Jesus who responds and says, right? That's what we were saying a few minutes ago. Right? He's not here for the righteous. He's not here for the Pharisees. Right? He's here for the sick. Right? It's like a doctor doesn't show up to help healthy people. Right? Doctor shows up to help the sick. Right? And I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Right? That sort of sums up in one sentence. Remember, we talked about this several times. And the prophets, God again and again, even though they weren't following what God had commanded them to do, even though they're living in completely the wrong way, they would still bring their sacrifices to the temple. Right? As if sort of, well, okay, brought my goat. God's happy. Right? Now I can go lie, cheat, steal. Right? Do whatever I want to do. And I'll bring him another goat next week. Right? And God said, no, you gotta stop with the goats. I don't want your goats. Right? I don't want the goats. Right? This is the same thing. Right? Pharisees, you've got your tassels on your robes, and you got your things on your head with the little Torah scroll in it, your prayer shawls, and you're doing all this stuff, following all the little rules. He's like, that's not the stuff I really want. Right? What I really want is for you to have a merciful heart and have compassion on these tax collectors who are lost, who are going to their destruction, right? Who so compromise themselves, so compromise themselves. And rather than you wanting to see them repent, right, and come back to worshiping the God of your fathers, you want to see them dead. You want to see them dead. You hate them. It's like the hate that your hate is more offensive to me than their tax collecting. They've got it completely flipped. It says, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And again, see, the goal there isn't to tell the Pharisees, I have no interest in you. The goal there is for the Pharisees to see that they're sinners too. And because they don't have any mercy in their hearts towards these tax collectors, they're sinners too. So he's really there for them too. He's there for them too. Verse 14, then the disciples of John came to him saying, why do we and the Pharisees fast often, but your disciples do not fast? So questions just keep coming. All right? So apparently we've got a faction here who are disciples of John the Baptist. And they say, well, we fast, right? Probably fasted all the time since John was eating locusts and honey and stuff. I'd fast too. Right? We fast. The Pharisees fast, right? They've got all kinds of fasting rules, the Pharisees. Right? They go, how come your disciples are sort of eating whatever they want all the time? Verse 15, Jesus said to them, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch pulls away from the garment and the tear is made worse. Nor do they put new wine into old wineskins, or else the wineskins break, the wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. This is one of the stranger passages in the New Testament. I followed the first part, right? Bridegroom, he's probably talking about himself, right? I'm here, so they're not fasting. When I leave, they'll fast. Okay, I'm with you. Then we start talking about patching garments and wine storage, and things kind of go a little sideways. So, part of what's going on here is that Jesus is referring to a tradition and some, how to put this? They're technically not extra biblical or apocryphal. It's some stories that were contemporary in the first century AD, and I'll explain a little more in a second. Okay. There's a book that we didn't read in the Old Testament. Called 4th Ezra. Remember, we read a bunch of Ezras.
Yeah.
We read some Ezras, but we didn't read 4th Ezra. 4th Ezra is not in the Septuagint, that's why we didn't read it. It is in the Slavonic Bible. This is why this whole thing about what's in the Old Testament gets confusing. That's why you guys start coming for the New Testament kind of a little easier. A little clearer. But it's also in the Ethiopian Old Testament. But there's tons of stuff in the Ethiopian. So, and basically it's a set of prophecies that are ascribed to Ezra. Long story short, one of these visions is the vision of the Bridegroom, it's called. Okay. And this was written down before the book of Matthew. Right? This is before Jesus' time. As most people think it was written sometime in the 1st century BC. And in this vision, there's this great festival about to start in the city of Jerusalem. And there's a bridegroom. It's sort of like in the Song of Solomon. It's heavily influenced by the Song of Solomon. There's a bridegroom who was also the king. Right? And he's gotten married. As we talked about before, the tradition at that time was after the marriage, the two would go into the bridal chamber, right, to consummate the marriage. And they would then emerge with evidence that the marriage had been consummated, right, to show that the wife had been a virgin, and so the whole marriage was valid. Well, in this vision, the bridegroom, who is the king, comes to the bridal chamber after the wedding, right, to go into his bride. Bride's already in. He gets to the threshold of the bridal chamber and falls down dead. It's the threshold of the bridal chamber, falls down dead. And all of of course, the women, right, who are there at the wedding, who are there to assist the bride, right, go into mourning and wailing, right, because the bridegroom is dead. The marriage was never consummated, so it never really happened, right, legally. Right. And so everyone ends up falling into despair. Okay. This vision, in the context of 4 Ezra, right after the vision is had, it says that this is a vision about the destruction of the temple in the Old Testament. Right. The idea being that we saw in the prophets, God used all the time this image of Israel as his bride, usually his unfaithful bride, right, who he had married and she ran around on, right? Well, this idea in 4th Ezra is getting at the idea, as we said, we saw in Ezekiel had this vision where God left the temple, and then it was destroyed. They rebuilt the temple, but he never came back. Right? So this image of the marriage between Israel and God never being consummated, never reaching its consummation, right, was a picture of sort of the mourning of the people, of the despair of the people waiting for God to return. Right? Is he going to return? Right? we had this thing, it died right before it could come to its full flower, is the idea. Okay? Jesus is going to reference this idea a lot. Okay, this is the first place here in Matthew. He references it several times. Okay? And it's also referenced a lot in our Holy Week services, not least of which is the Bridegroom has. This whole idea, right? And also in our liturgics for Pascha. There's a lot of stuff about Christ emerging from the tomb as from a bridal chamber. Right? That's what that's getting at. That now finally in Christ's resurrection, this union of God and his people is consummated. Right? It's finally reached its completion. That never happened in the old covenant. Right? And now in Christ it happens. Okay? But so, notice, can the friends of the bridegroom mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast. Right? So, yes, we'll get to it in a second, he's referring himself, but the first thing they would have thought of was the temple. Right? This vision in the temple. Well, no, we didn't mourn before the exile. Right? We didn't mourn and fast. It was after. Right? After the temple was destroyed. That's when we mourned and wept, in the river, by the river in Babylon. When we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Yeah, right, okay. Right. Christ is then connecting that to himself. Right? That's why my disciples don't fast now. Right? Because I'm with them. Which makes him what? The new temple.
Makes him
The new temple. The new place where God is present with them. Right? So the time is coming, right, when we're going to be parted. And then they'll fast. Right? But until that time, they're not going to fast. This is pointing to a new covenant. Right? You're fasting based on, they fasted for the whole month when the temple was destroyed. Right? You're fasting based on those things that have happened in the past. Okay? Those things that have happened in the past. God is doing something through Christ now. Right? So they're not fasting based on what happened in the past. Right? They're concerned with what's going on now. But in the future, right? In the future, there's going to be a new covenant. There'll be fasts and feasts and all those things just like there were in the old covenant. Right? So he's pointing to the fact that the reason they're not fasting is we're in this transition. Right? We're in this transition from one to the other. Then to explain what he means about that transition, that's where he gets into these images. Okay? And the first image is, if I have an old pair of jeans and I get a hole in the knee like I used to all the time when I was a kid, right? I'd fall down, scrape it open, and my knee, get blood and grass stains all over it, right? And my mom would get one of those patches, right? Well, if she went and got a patch that was brand new cloth that had never been washed, right? And it was the exact size of the hole. And she sewed it around the edge of the hole, and then she threw my jeans in the wash. What would happen? Patch would shrink, it would rip again. Right? That's what Jesus is saying. No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth in an old garment. Patch pulls away from the garment, makes the tear worse. Right? Nor, right, do you put new wine that's just starting to ferment into old leather. Right? Old leather wineskins. Right? Because as it ferments, the gases will expand, and right, the old leather is brittle, it'll break open. Right? So he's saying what God is doing now, right? The new thing that he's doing now can't be contained within, can't be understood with the old. Right? We talked about fulfillment, right? Being sort of filled to overflowing. Right? There's something new happening that's bigger and beyond the old covenant, the way you're used to thinking about things and looking at things. Right? And so you can't take what I'm doing and try and shove it back into those boxes and those categories. Okay? And so you can't expect Jesus' disciples to dress like the Pharisees, right? Because they're part of a new people of Israel. They're part of a new thing that God is doing that's superior and bigger than the old one. Not that's destroying the old one, but it's bigger and better, right? It's bigger and better. And so that's the connection there between those kind of weird examples and this stuff with the bridegroom, is it's through this story. And the fact that it's referenced so much is why it's in like the Slavonic Bible. It's in the even though none of the fathers say it's a canonical book of the Old Testament, it's referenced so often. It's sort of like we're going to see when we get into the latter part of the New Testament towards the end, several books reference the book of 1 Enoch. The book of 1 Enoch isn't in the Old Testament. And nobody thought it was canonical, but it gets referenced. So it has some value in terms of understanding how the New Testament refers to it. Oh, let's get a little further. Verse 18, while he spoke these things to them, behold, a ruler came and worshipped him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live. So we're going to another level now. Right? We're going to another level. He's healed a lot of sick people. Right? He's shown he has power over storms. Right? He's shown he has power over demons. Now we get right to it. Death. Right? Death. Life and death. Right? And so this ruler comes to him. Usually when you see ruler in the New Testament like this, it doesn't mean like the Roman governor, right? Or King Herod. Ruler, the word that's used here is more like superintendent, and it's usually used as a ruler for the ruler of the synagogue. There was all of the synagogues in all of these towns had somebody who was essentially not a rabbi, wasn't necessarily the one who taught or preached, but who basically took care of the building, took care of the scrolls, the Torah scrolls, did a lot of the funding usually. He was sort of the president of the parish council of your local synagogue, right? Might be a good way or a good analogy, right? He was sort of the head of the board, chairman of the board of the synagogue. Okay. So he comes and says, my daughter just died. Come and lay your hand on her and she will live. Notice he doesn't come up and say, hey, can you do anything? Right? It doesn't say she just died, it's only been 5 minutes, am I too late? Right? He comes and says, if you go and put your hands on her, she will come back to life. That's kind of extreme faith, right? That's it, right? I believe you have power over life and death. So we've reached another level. And so Jesus arose and followed him, and so did his disciples. And suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, if only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, be of good cheer, daughter. Your faith has made you well. And the woman was made well from that hour. So, in passing, right, this woman with this flow of blood, and this is menstrual blood. That's what this is referring to. So you can imagine, for 12 years, right, the extreme sickness, anemia, and everything this woman's been suffering. You have to add to that Jewish culture, she's been unclean for 12 years because of this issue of blood, right? Meaning no one will touch her, no one will come near her, right? She's not allowed to come near or touch anyone. So her coming up and touching the hem of his garment is kind of a gutsy move, right? Because she's just technically, according to the rules, made him unclean. But remember what we've seen with Jesus starting with the baptism, right? And then when he touched the leper, right? When unclean things touch Jesus, he doesn't become unclean, they become clean. Right? It sort of works in reverse, right? The water gets made holy by his baptism, and Right? The leper gets cleansed by him touching him. In the same way, she comes up and touches him. Rather than making Jesus unclean, he purifies and cleanses her. Right? And then rather than being angry about it, as any good Pharisee would have been, woman, how dare you touch me? Now I can't go to the temple because I'm unclean. Right? He turns her out and says, be of good cheer, your faith has made you well. So verse 23, when Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing. Flute players is kind of a... it's like someone dies and you just have a bunch of guys go play the flute. But it's more musicians, right? And the idea was the musicians and the noisy crowd wailing. They had, at the time, professional wailers. I know this sounds crazy. But especially for a rich person like the ruler of the synagogue, when someone died in their family, they would hire these people to come and basically make a big scene at the funeral. Right? And in the funeral procession, to wail and scream and go, oh! Right? Because obviously the more of that went on at your funeral, the more important you were and the more missed you are. Right? So we'll go and hire some people so everyone knows just how tragic it is that I died. Right? So that's who it's saying. Jesus shows up at the house and sees sort of these people doing their thing. Right? Doing their thing. Verse 24, he said to them, make room, for the girl is not dead but sleeping. Right? So he's got to kind of push past right, these people to get past them. He says, oh, she's not dead. Get out of here. She's not dead. She's just sleeping. And they ridiculed him because, of course, back then they could tell a dead person when they saw a dead person. When the crowd was put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went out into all that land. Right, so he goes, picks her up by the hand, and she becomes alive again. Okay. Now, this is not to say that Jesus was saying, and you will see some people interpret it this way, on our Friend the History Channel especially, that the problem was in the first century, these poor Judean peasants, they didn't understand science. Right? So some poor girl goes into a little bit of a coma. They all think she's dead. Right? They all think she's dead. Jesus, being kind of smart, right, knows, oh, she's just in a coma. Right? So he comes and says, oh, she's just sleeping, you silly primitives. Right? Grabs her by the hand and picks her up and, raises her from the dead. Right? And so this is the kind of thing that silly people believed in back then. Miraculous healings and people getting raised from the dead. Because they weren't smart like us, didn't understand science. Right? That this sort of thing doesn't happen. And they'll even go and they'll talk about this with Jesus rising, but when Jesus rises from the dead, they'll be like, oh, well, they just thought stuff like that happened. Right? Because they didn't get science. Okay. Everyone was very clear in the first century that dead people did not come back to life. Okay. You can pick up any philosopher, right? At Cicero, Aristotle. They knew that when you were dead, you were dead. Right? that was it. That you weren't coming back. Okay? And you could read their medical treatises. They knew the difference between a coma and being dead. That's why they waited 3 days. Right? Remember, in the Gospel of John, they make such a big deal out of the fact that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Right? They waited 3 days because they knew that sometimes people go into a coma. It looks like they're dead. They're not really dead. Right? So that's why they waited 3 days. If it went 3 days with no signs of life whatsoever, they said it started to smell. They'd say, okay, dead. They understood that. Okay? And Joseph wasn't all upset when Mary got pregnant because he didn't know where babies came from. He was upset because he did know where babies came from. Right? That's what made him mad. Because he knew how that worked. That it was upsetting to him. Okay? So we got to get this out of our head that the people were stupid. They knew dead. Okay? So this is not, Jesus just being a little smarter and savvier than the average Judean. This girl was dead. This girl had died. Right? And Jesus brought her back to life. Okay? And yes, at some point in the future, she died again. Right? But at this point. And so this is in the category here of one of his healings. As we've seen, this goes again. We ratcheted it up another level. Right? We're getting more and more evidence here. So part of what's going on is we've seen in the chapter we read tonight, St. Matthew clarifying who it is who the enemy is. Right? Who it is who the enemy is. How it is that Jesus is fighting that enemy. Right? By purifying and redeeming people, by healing people spiritually, not by wiping out the bad guys and the good guys. And now we're also seeing St. Matthew making a gradual case for just who Jesus is. Right? So we're seeing these things slowly, the evidence sort of pile up and escalate in terms of who he is. So I think we'll stop there for now. We got about a chapter. We got half of one chapter, half of another chapter. And we'll pick up here, I think next week, unless anybody has a reason not to. Okay. So yeah, we'll pick up here next week. And thank you, everybody.